Welcome to another episode of The Artsy Raven, a show about writing and publishing with your host, J.F. Garrard.
Welcome to another episode of The Artsy Raven. Today our special guest is Sue Chang. Sue is a Chinese-Canadian writer born and raised in Shanghai and the daughter of a reluctant Red Guard leader. Her fiction has been recognized in Prairie Fire Short Fiction Contest, the Canadian Authors Association's National Writing Contest, the ILS Fence Fiction Contest, and the Master Reviews Novel Excerpt Contest, among others. More of her essays and fiction are forthcoming in LitHub, Ex-Puritan, Open Book, LitRic Literature, 49 Shelf, etc. Publishers Weekly called her debut novel, The Immortal Woman, unflinching, powered by raw emotion, a cathartic account of a family buffeted by the winds of modern Chinese history. Hi, Sue. Welcome.
Hi, JF. Thanks so much for having me.
No problem. Now, let's see. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, like sort of where you grew up and how you started writing in English?
Yeah, sure. So I grew up in Shanghai until I was in my 20s, actually. I immigrated from Shanghai to North America. So my father actually is the one who studied Chinese literature when he was young. He is a lifelong reader and writer. So I think under his influence, when I was a child in Shanghai, I also became an avid reader. I even wrote a couple of short stories and got them published when I was still in primary school and middle school. And then in my 20s, I immigrated by myself to North America. I was really very optimistic at the time, foolishly optimistic. I was really eager to forge my own path. Really had no idea what was in store for me. So I didn't know I would get tongue-tied in my newly adopted language when I was expected to speak. I didn't know I would move around a lot to sustain myself. I didn't expect the isolation and loneliness. So in that first decade of my immigration, books were really my lifeline. I sought out books from and or about immigrants as if they were my survival guides, and they really were. And eventually I started constructing stories too. I think I wanted to be in conversation with the voices that had pulled me out of the tentacles of depression and offered me solace and hope in those early years. Yeah, that's when I started writing.
Now, because you came over later, like so you must have read mostly in Chinese?
So when I was in China, yeah, I was writing in Chinese, certainly. After I left, I basically didn't write until I was ready to write in English. So
Oh,
after I
okay.
immigrated, I only wrote in English. Yeah.
Oh, that's very interesting because that's your second language. You're not writing in your first language.
Yeah, I think that's almost like a common experience now for a lot of Chinese writers in diaspora. It's you do feel more free writing in English. We were in our culture, we were not taught to be too expressive. So a lot of the emotions were sort of bottled when it was expressed in Chinese, whereas in English, I felt like I could express myself more freely. There's certainly some concerns about the materials I'm writing, and I think there's more self-censorship when I wrote in Chinese. So yeah, English became a new medium for me. Yeah.
And Chinese language, I mean, I'm not very literate in Chinese, but it's a very formal language, the way it's structured. Is
Yeah.
very different from English.
Very, very different. Yes. It's definitely a huge transformation. Yes. Um,
Now, tell me a little bit about what led to you writing The Immortal Woman and what is that book about?
sure. Yeah. So I will first tell you what the book is about. So the book is about a pair of Chinese mother and daughter. They were wrestling with the demons of their past. So the mother, she was once a student Red Guard leader in the 1960s Shanghai. Later, she became a journalist at a state newspaper. Um, So she then was involved in an act of violence during the Tiananmen Square protest. She lost all hope for her country after that. Um, and the daughter is a student at an American university. She came to America with the mission to become a true Westerner. So she um, try to erase her birth identity. She abandons a Chinese suitor. She pursues a white love interest. All at the same time, she was hunted by the scars of her upbringing as well. But then later, following China's meteoric rise, the mother is actually slowly dragged into a nationalistic perspective. And that really stuns the daughter. They had lots of conflicts, and eventually they had this final confrontation that resulted in tragic consequences. But the book did end on a note of hope. So what inspired me to write it? I wouldn't say this is autofiction, but when I was growing up in China in the 80s and 90s, I was very puzzled by the adults around me. They had a lot of arguments, and I feel like these arguments really unveil their hidden ire and pain, those old grudges from a very tumultuous time. But I couldn't trace that time in my history books. So growing up, I kind of saw myself as belonging to a generation with no history. And then after I immigrated to North America as an adult, I began to have access to the tabooed past of my birth country. Um, and I started to hope to make sense of the incongruency that had haunted my life. So over the years, I read a lot. I watched documentaries, and eventually I was able to see a clear line from the tribulations of my parents and grandparents' generation to the conundrums of my own generation. So eventually, I just thought, okay, I need to write it down to make sense of all. This was really started when after I gave birth to my first child, I was probably under the influence of postpartum depression as well. A lot of sleepless nights, hyper alert to danger, hypersensitive about a question of heritage and all of that. So I really decided to get to work during that difficult time to kind of peel back the curtain of my hometown, to confront the bygone days, and also the unresolved trauma still lingering in the blood of my generation. So yeah, it was a long process to get here.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you were able to create something out of your depression. I mean, you're also one of, well, I don't know that many people from, well, actually, the new generation is different. The old generation, there's no such thing as depression. Like it's not something that's talked about
Yeah,
in the culture because you don't want people to know and all that stuff. But now it's a little bit different. I'm glad it's
right,
different because in a way it helps people overcome it, right? If you don't talk about it, nothing's going to
right.
change. So,
Yeah, I feel like I'm the middle generation
yeah.
under the influence of both.
Yeah. Now, was it hard to get your book published?
Yeah. I think it's just really hard. It's hard for any writers to start out now. I'm sure I'm sure most of your listeners know. Yeah, so I started taking writing courses. And in that process, eventually I met a few mentors, some really good mentors who strongly encouraged me to just put my manuscript out there, query agents. They told me, well, you should query some small publishers at the same time and see what came out of it. I think I did that for more than a year. Um, I think I queried about 40 agents in the US and Canada, and about 10 small presses at the same time. And the process was just slow, so slow. You are just waiting and waiting. And then I was really lucky. So in that year, I got one agent who said no to me, but at the same time, she gave me a bunch of wonderful notes, very comprehensive notes, telling me why it was a no. I understand this is extremely rare in the industry.
Hmm.
So to this day, I was really grateful to this agent for taking the time to write me that long letter. So I really took her critiques and suggestions to heart. I revised my manuscript quite significantly based on her notes. And then I queried again with the new manuscript. At the time, I still have a list of people I haven't queried because once they've said no to you, they won't look at it again. But there was still a second list that I haven't queried. So within a month, actually, I got a yes using the new manuscript. Then I signed with the agent, and then he put together the submission list. And then we went on submission after about 2 months. And then got an offer from House of Nancy quite quickly. Yeah, I feel really lucky because, the agent told me so much in that initial communication. And then House of Nancy is really my dream publisher. So I've admired their work for such a long time. Yeah, it's a long, long journey.
Now, writers tend to face a lot of rejection. How do you handle this, and do you have any tips for other people?
Right. Yeah, so much rejection. I found it astounding to have so much rejection every stage of a writing career. Certainly when you're querying agents, and then later querying publishers. And once you have a publishing deal, you're still getting rejections because you need to get blurbs, and people often would not have time to do blurbs. When you're trying to get reviews, often you get rejected at that stage as well. And eventually your work may be rejected by general readers or reviewers. Yeah, and I know a lot of writers who, trying to apply for MFA programs, and they can get rejected at that stage, or writing grants. Yeah, so a lot of rejections. I honestly, I don't have any secret formula, but I tend to go for walks a lot in nature whenever I get too many rejections in a short time period. I have young kids, so I find a lot of inspirations from my kids actually. And I have a day job as well, so focus on my day job, focus on paying the bills. Um, and I just try to remind myself, yes, writing is my passion, but it's really not the only center of my life. And the other thing I found kind of helpful is just so much is truly just happening around the world. I am an avid reader of newspaper as well, just all the things that's happening, the wars, the climate disaster, AI taking over our jobs and future and all of that. I feel like we're at the cusp of a highly unpredictable, difficult era. So sometimes I tell myself it's almost too petty to worry about rejections I get as a writer, given that there's so much atrocity that's really happening in the
Yeah.
world. So yeah, that kind of perspective helps me as well.
Now, you sound very busy. You have a day job, and there are children and
Mm.
family. So how do you focus on writing?
Yeah, it honestly it comes and goes. So there are time of my life I can find a bit more time in to devote to writing, and there are times, I would go by months without finding proper time to write. In those periods, I try to focus on reading, research. Those are things I feel I could fit in a busy life, but to actually sit down and create a world is asking a bit too much of myself, and I could get into panic mode. Yeah, but there are times, occasionally I can take some time off from work as well to focus for a few weeks. I certainly basically use all my vacation for writing as well.
Oh, wow.
Um, yeah, my kids perhaps suffered from my personal passion. Yeah, it really comes and goes. I sort of write in bursts.
Oh, I don't think you should think the kids are suffering. I mean, they have something to look forward to maybe in the future when they're old enough to read. Although I don't know. I don't think my son cares about my stuff, but I try to do
Yeah,
little projects with him. We did a picture book together, and then after that, he was like, "It's too much work." I was like, "Yes, it is a lot of work."
right. Yeah, yeah. And we'll be lucky if our kids read.
Read. Yeah, that is true.
Oh,
That is true. Oh gosh. So
yeah.
what is do you have any other projects going on? Is it along a similar theme about Asian culture or
Yeah. So I'm very slowly working on I think it will be a crime mystery book.
okay.
It, I do have a first draft, but it's very rough and there's so much to work on. It involves um, an immigrant sleuth and her queer best friend. So it is still sort of situated in the diaspora. Um, yeah. I don't know when I'll be ready to show that manuscript to anyone.
Oh, that's okay. It's okay. I mean, when it's ready, right? So,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
okay. Do you have any writing advice for people that are starting to write?
Um, so I myself is an outliner. I know a lot of my writer friends are actually pantsers. But for me, perhaps because my busy life and also just the way my brain works, I really get very paralyzed in front of a completely blank page. I need some sort of a roadmap to boost my confidence. So I'm a big advocate for outlining your big writing project. In fact, whenever I have trouble completing just a section or a chapter of a book, I will go back to outlining again just to see where I am on this journey, where the end point is, and how do I figure out how to get there in a more detailed step-to-step fashion. Um, I know a lot of people say that take a bit of surprise out of the process, but I just find it's a worthy trade-off for paralysis caused by complete uncertainty. Um, and, you know, writing this novel, I spent years writing it. I just think there's so many surprises in store at the granular level of writing.
Mhm.
So I'm really not missing out too much on the fun. Um, and in terms of yeah, how to get it done, I do think it is very important to find time to write consistently if you are in a big project. I think to have a word count every day can really help. I certainly always have a word count target when I was writing my first draft. And I would not sleep until I hit that word count target for the day. Reading a lot, very, very important, and reading with writer's eye. Um, and I reread this book. It's from Janet Burroway. You probably know this book called Writing Fiction. I reread this book all the time. There's just so many systemic um, wisdom of how to write fiction. So whenever I get stuck, I sort of go back to this my textbook and I'll see, okay, what am I missing here, and how to apply her advice in my own writing practice. Um, yeah, so these are things that helped me in writing the first book.
Oh, well, thank you for sharing. Okay, Sue, so you're going to do a reading for us. Can you give us a little bit of context about what you're reading and then you can start?
Sure. Yeah, so here we meet the leader of the Workers' Propaganda Committee during the Cultural Revolution. So, in the later stage of the Cultural Revolution, the Workers' Propaganda Committee was essentially the boss of the student red guards in each school district.
And you're
Um,
reading from the Immortal Woman, right?
Correct, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
So for many years, Chang, this character you will meet in this part of the reading, he is the leader of the Workers' Propaganda Committee, and he pines for LeMay, the mother character in our novel. So by this point, LeMay has completed high school, and she has been discharged from the Red Guards. Chang now stalks her around her workplace. So that's where we start the reading. Shall I go ahead?
Sure.
Okay. 1981. Even after 5 years, dead fish still made him squirm. Hundreds of them lined up with their bulging, despairing eyes, mouths wide open, as if they were incredulous at their untimely death and horrified by their afterlives. For 10 hours a day every day, he suppressed nausea and descaled those strange creatures of the sea, sculpting open their fleshy white bellies, reaching into the slimy cavities, and pulling out the pink guts and translucent balloons. A clean, decapitated shell was his final product, passed on to the next workstation. At the end of each day, he'd wash the floor on all fours, scrubbing away blood and innards so that he'd have a spotless station to return to the next morning. He knew it was futile. The floor would be covered with filth as soon as the new day began, but besides cleaning, he couldn't think of another way to preserve his last shred of dignity. He was one of the lucky ones. As a running dog of the gang of four, he could have been thrown in jail or shot point blank when the Cultural Revolution ended. Instead, he got his precious anonymity on the assembly line of a fish jerky factory. Each day, he left work at 7, dragging his empty, sore body the 3 kilometers back to his basement bachelor pad. He'd pass a newspaper stand and buy a copy of the Liberation Daily. At home, he'd fix himself a plain white bun and a small plate of fermented tofu, and search the paper for LeMay's article. He'd savor every word, sometimes looking up unknown phrases in a beat-up dictionary. He'd cut out her article and plaster it on his wall with the rest of them. He used to line them all up around his bed, pretending they were personal messages from her, imagining her whispering the words into his ears as he drifted to sleep. Now that there was no more space by his bed, articles proliferated beside his dining table, above his cupboard, around his stove. He was proud of her. He could still picture the first time he'd noticed her at a school rally all those years ago, and how shocked he had been by the familiarity of her beauty, those wide feline eyes, that delicate button nose, that upturned chin, even a small red mole above her pouty lips, all of which had reminded him of the village belle he'd long lost. After that, he had lingered outside her classroom, watching the sun rays pirouette on the back of her silky black braids, like he'd done in his boyhood, sitting behind his village love, dumbfounded by her perfection. Now, alone in his subterranean existence, he couldn't wait for their nightly reunion. If he was lucky, she'd come into his dream as his new bride. It was always a summer night, lavish with the heady scent of gardenias. Faceless guests would cram into their apartment bearing wedding gifts, a double happiness pillow, a jade spitten, a dozen red-dyed eggs, a pair of thermoses adorned with blooming peonies. LeMay's mother would splurge on a queen-size quilt with a coveted dragon phoenix pattern. After a toast, everyone would sit down to a feast. Braised pork balls, kung pao chicken, mapo tofu, golden crispy spring rolls, complete with dowry cakes and sweet lotus seed soup. The guests would eat ravenously, oily sauce dripping from the corners of their mouths. They'd grow tipsy on 3 bottles of baijiu. But his focus would be squarely on his bride, in her perfectly fitted linen tunic and a knee-length crimson skirt, about accentuating her hourglass figure. He'd pray for time to run faster so they could be left alone. When the clock struck midnight, the guests would bow their drunken heads and take their leave, shouting a mix of revolutionary slogans and obscenities into the dark night. Shivering, he'd usher his bride into their bedroom and under the dragon phoenix quilt. He'd cradle her soft body, purrs escaping his throat. He'd slide his hand under her skirt, feeling her silky smooth thighs with his fingertips. Almost always, his dream would crash to an end then, and he'd wake in despair, sticky liquid running down his legs. On Sundays, when he didn't have to work, he'd hide inside a musty stairwell across the street from LeMay's paper, knowing she'd been working on weekends ever since her best friend had left. In the beginning, when he was still foolish and brave, he'd approach her at the gate. She'd run the other way as soon as she spotted him, ignoring his pleas to hear him out. He'd seethed and remembered their first and only kiss. For a few seconds on that sweltering August afternoon, he had tasted euphoria, chewing on her supple flesh and feeling himself with a confidence he'd never known in this life. When the village belle of his youth left him for a Beijing soldier, he had been a nobody. But staring down at LeMay then, he was convinced he could give the girl whatever she wanted if only she'd let him. Now, he was back to square one, a nobody once more. He had to be content with watching her from afar. He soon learned the pleasure of stalking, the power of being the one in the shadows, of stripping agency from the one under the sun as he balanced her distant, figurine-like body on his palm and kissed every inch of it. When a letter from his village elder arrived in the spring of 1981, he sensed the news of his old life tightening around his neck. His mother had late-stage stomach cancer, the ancient man informed him in his chicken scratch. And as her only child, and a son no less, he was duty-bound to shepherd his mother through the last leg of her journey. For days, his terminally ill ma, ensconced in a wheelchair and smiling feebly, beckoned him in his dreams. Despite a coveted Shanghai hukou awarded to him at the start of the Cultural Revolution, he knew he'd forever be an outsider in this metropolis, laboring for the rest of his life at the fish station and languishing in the underground hole he called home. He didn't want to admit it to himself, but once he returned to the verdant fields of his childhood, he would not find the strength to leave again. 2 weeks later, he went to the Shanghai train station and bought a ticket for the next outbound Sunday express to Yangzhou. That night, his dream began mercifully in the privacy of their wedding chamber. His body entwined with LeMay's. When an explosion of pleasure sent him reeling and gulping for air, he clung to her like a resolute pilgrim. The treacherous world dissolved as he traced her naked contours with his fingers, fascinated by every little detail. How impossible it seemed to harbor a feeling so intense, yet so private. Without the zeal of the loudspeakers, posters, slogans, rallies, no wonder romantic love had to be vilified as bourgeois drivel, the arch enemy of the revolution. I stop here.
Well, thank you very much for being on our show.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
So good luck with everything.
Thanks so much, JF.
For more upcoming episodes of the Artsy Raven about writing and publishing, visit us at jfgarage.com/arpodcast. A reminder to Patreon subscribers that there is bonus content available for every episode on the Patreon website. If you enjoyed the show, you can show your appreciation by buying us some digital coffee. The Artsy Raven is produced by J.F. Garrard. The voice in the show's introduction is Chris Gorman, and music is by Tim Moore. Thank you for tuning in. Until next time, stay safe.